Hi, Jackie.
Hey, Young, you should have screen sharing privileges now.
Sounds good.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the second episode of the CEDA lecture series. Today, we're going to be hearing from Young Kwon, one of what I would consider the best researchers in policy debate about research. So Young, take it away.
Sounds good. Let me share my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen, Jackie?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So yeah, thank you, Jackie, for inviting me to talk everything and all about research. My name is Young. I'm one of the assistant debate coaches at Harvard, but I'm also studying health policy research at University of Pittsburgh. So I just want to say research is one of my favorite activities, both in debate and outside of debate. So I'm very excited to talk about that with everyone today. So the structure of today's discussion, I will first talk about how you should approach research. I'm assuming that there might be a lot of students here who are in the activity for the first time or kind of starting with not that much background in debate and research in general. So I kind of wanted to share how I approach research whenever the new season comes around and I have a given topic. What do I do? Where do I move forward? And I'm hoping that will answer some of the kind of questions and frustrations about where do I even start and what should I look for when doing research. Then I'll talk about researching different components and parts of an argument. And I will mostly talk about the search terms because I think once you know what to do, once you know what to research about, I think it's just a question of implementation and being able to find articles that say exactly what you want is important piece of this. So I'll definitely be talking about that. And then I will discuss some other resources and tips, especially implementing search strategies in different databases, and specifically I will talk about Google because we spend a lot of time using that, and also Lexis and Nexus, which I think will be very useful considering that this year is a legal topic. And I've also dedicated some small section about researching policy argument versus the critiques, or kind of how you should approach when you're researching policy literature versus the critique literature. So I'm definitely not really an expert on researching critiques, but I'm hoping that some of my tips will resonate with people and that will be helpful. And I will mostly be talking from the perspective of negative because most of the time that's what you're going to be doing. There's a lot of affirmatives that you have to research. So I'm kind of approaching this from the perspective of if I were to, research a case neg, how should I approach and creating that file. So how to approach research, which is the first part. And I think that when I first joined debate, everything was really overwhelming. There's a lot of terms you need to know. There's a lot of actual speech things that you have to learn. So research wasn't something that I was really, invested in the beginning because I was busy doing other parts of and learning about other parts of debate. But I think part of that kind of made me very overwhelming with the idea of research in terms of like what should I research? What should I research? How do I even start in thinking about cutting cards? And one kind of orientation that really helped me a lot when I was researching for the first time is that you should think of research as a tool to outline and understand the contours of major arguments for a given topic. So really the goal isn't for you to come up with something grand and new and creative all of a sudden, but for a given topic, your job is to find what are people saying about for a given topic. Like, why are people saying that we should establish personhood for AI, nature, and animals, and what are the people on the opposite side saying? And you can kind of use it as a tool to gather information in terms of what are the arguments that people are saying back and forth to each other within the literature, and that is what you're trying to discover and explore. And I think approaching that way has many benefits in terms of conceptualizing research this way. So I think it definitely reduces the pressure of having to find something new. Like, we are not really doing primary research. Like everything that we do is mostly secondary research and, cutting cards that are already written out there. So it's not really, we shouldn't really think too hard about like we have to like find something that haven't been said before. Like our job is to just simply excavate existing arguments and illuminate them so we can bring them and talk about them in debate. And I think another reason why this orientation is important because it allows you to map key points of disagreement, which I think just makes you a better debater because you know the strengths and weaknesses of major arguments. So if you think that after researching all of the app solvency advocates, you realize that they don't really have a good answer to this disadvantage, then that's something that should guide strategy going into the tournament, going into the round. That I know like this affirmative weakness is this, so this is what we should research, and this is how we should debate this affirmative. And I think that it also provides a useful way to structure files because oftentimes, you are given an assignment and they're like, oh, cut this ad. And then you're kind of like, okay, what do I need to include in the file? So if you are able to kind of map arguments, that means that you can kind of keep track of what are the things that you're going to have to include in the file so that for everything that you include, there's going to be a counter response or counter warrant so that you're able to anticipate those and make sure that, they're going to say this in response to this disadvantage. So we need to make sure that we include cards that answer those sets of arguments in the file. So that, you will have something to respond with if someone says some XYZ in response to the disadvantage. So after establishing that orientation, then I kind of want to talk about like what are the physical steps then you take to accomplishing that goal of like mapping arguments. So I think you should make the first thing, when I get the topic and I'm realizing that we're like the first tournament is like within 2 weeks. So this is like a little bit late to do at this point, but when I, going into the season, when there's a new topic, what I do is just do like a lot of Google searches, more general searches that will help me make a list of major affirmatives that they will be read. And by major affirmatives, I mean like apps with prominent solvency articles, because those are like, at least in the beginning of the season, you need to have good cards that defend your proposal for really to have a viable affirmatives, because you're going to have to debate a lot of things that you might not necessarily, you might not be able to predict beforehand. So more, better the defense of whatever plan that you're defending, then obviously those are going to be more popular affirmatives. And I think at least in the beginning of the season, people kind of tend to congregate around those areas. So I think once you kind of make the list of that affirmative, I think for each app and solvency advocate, you should write down what are going to be the major advantages to these affirmatives and what exactly is the proposal that they advocate, and what are the possible counter arguments to the proposal, which is the type of arguments that that it'd be good for you to map and in terms of figuring out what are the major back and forth and arguments within the literature. And I think once you do this for all of the affirmatives or nearly all of the affirmatives, I think you'll be able to also better generate the list of negative arguments, because sorting through all of these articles will make you just generally more informed about what are the pros and cons of personhood and whatnot. So I wanted to just give a brief example of what I did for this topic. So I mostly did AI research in the before the season. So I kind of looked to see, what are the different proposals available that establishes rights and duties of personhood within the literature. And I think this paper actually was this paper I think actually was included in as one of the solvency advocate in the topic paper. So I just wanted to read that article and see like what it says, because at this point I really didn't know anything about personhood, which I think most people, I'm assuming most people can relate to that they didn't know about this legal thing up until this topic rolled around. So this article kind of talked about how the current liability regime for AI is one that's going to disincentivize innovation, and kind of talks about, and this is a copy of the paragraph that I gathered from the article, and basically talks about the notion of strict liability, where if there's like anytime that AI harms some individual, basically like the manufacturer or whoever made the AI might be strictly liable. So they'll be liable for all of the damages. And this part of the article kind of talks about how that would be devastating for innovation, because perhaps maybe manufacturers, we shouldn't hold them responsible when the AI is making autonomous decisions. So then it kind of talked about like how that would implicate the innovation policy as it relates to the AI. And then this part of the article later down on the page, they actually talk about the proposal that they advocate to resolve the problem of tort liability and innovation issue. And it talks about a partial grant of corporate personhood to the AI system, and then and kind of goes on in describing how that would entail. And there's like some description of like how that interacts with like different incentives that people have in developing the AI, or how it is going to work. And then later, there's also a part of the article that kind of talks about like what critiques have said, or critiques have written about in relations to AI personhood. And this paragraph kind of says that critiques argue that granting rights of personhood to AI would improperly violate humanist exceptionalism. So it seems like there are some arguments about how giving personhood to AI will like degrade human rights. And one of the footnotes for footnote 226, it kind of further goes on and cites like other articles. But so in this case, it cites an article from Watson that talks about like the ethical consequences of granting personhood to algorithms, and how it says that it's going to rob us of our own autonomy. And then the last part of the article then kind of responds to that criticism by saying that the AF is not necessarily saying that we should give like a full-blown personhood, but rather it's like a limited corporate personhood for the sake of like hashing through liability issue. And specifically, there's a line in there in the first paragraph at the end says that it's not an all or nothing proposition. So kind of reading through these different parts of the article, even just reading the one article alone, we just now generated a description of the proposal, which people will read as the plan. There was a description of an advantage, like it's going to be like this app will probably talk about innovation in one way or the other. And there's also a case neg argument. So we found that a lot of people talked about how it's going to like degrade human rights. So there seems to be some arguments about human exceptionalism DA. And I think I forgot to mention, but this part of the article also talks about opposition to the European Union proposal to grant legal personhood, and like a bunch of people and bunch of experts came out and said that AI should we should not do that. So perhaps that could be like another another sort of literature that you could go into, like read all of those letters and figure out what are the other things that people have said. And then we also found out about the affirmative response to the negative argument, which is that personhood is not an all or nothing proposition. So even though this was just like one simple article, I feel like after reading it, I feel more comfortable and more knowledgeable about what kind of like the contours of argument here is, which I think kind of provides you with the blueprint or roadmap of where to go from here. So if you are, for example, if you're a 2A and you're responsible for cutting the affirmative and you really like this idea, then what you should be doing is to keep researching this proposal. So you should obviously cut the card, since now you have the article, and it looks like a good card. So you should cut them and then like put it in your repository. You can also see what other articles cite this proposal, and I'm going to be talking about this later in the database section, but maybe perhaps you could, part of Google Scholar allows you to see what other articles have cited this proposal, so maybe you could go look at that. Or you could also generate a list of search terms that you can use to find other similar solvency articles. So it looks like in the context of this affirmative, it looks like there's a lot written about liability mechanism or strict liability or a corporate personhood. So I think all of those things you could potentially use as search terms to find other articles that talk about similar mechanisms, and perhaps that's going to lead you to finding more solvency articles or other apps that you might like it a little bit better, that is a little bit distinct or a little bit more limited than this version. And on the other hand, if you're a 2N, then you pretty much do the same thing. You will discover other articles that reference this proposal. So you should look at other articles citing this proposals, and using the same search terms, you should try to find articles that kind of indict this proposal. And at least from just reading this article, it looks like we have a direction in terms of where to go. Like it looks like there's a disadvantage about like human rights or human exceptionalism. So that is like one thing that you could research. Like you could research about like human rights, AI, and personhood, and see like where that leads to. But I think kind of using this as like a jumping point, you could definitely kind of go into all sorts of different directions, which I think each time you do that, it kind of creates new vectors of knowledge that will help you keep going and like find other arguments that will be that'll be useful. So I kind of talked about looking at other articles that cite this proposal. So I just went to Google Scholar, put this article in there, and then it looks like there are 2 articles citing this, and mostly from the same author who written about AI in different contexts. But like I haven't read these 2 articles, but I can imagine that perhaps the author might elaborate more about the proposal that they have written in the previous article. There might be other relevant factors that are not included in the previous article. So like the first article here talks about antitrust. So like how does antitrust interact with AI personhood? So I think that might be another direction that you could kind of jump off of and say like, oh, I think that there might be something related to antitrust, and I'm going to research that in the context of AI corporate personhood. And then the second article, just based on reading the article title and then the article description, it kind of looks like it's about automating an administration. So perhaps this is like an additional advantage for the affirmative. Like there might be something about how AI, like how it is used in the context of government administration, and perhaps that is another advantage that might be read to this corporate personhood idea. So I think just kind of keep these kind of open up new directions that you could potentially explore, and hopefully find something that are fruitful. And I've also mentioned, generating search terms from the article that I think that you should just like know more about. And I kind of mentioned that, the thesis of the proposal seems to be about limited liability and AI systems. So then I went to Lexis, and then I wanted to look at limited liability and AI and see what articles have been written. And then there are 19 articles to sort through. the first one is citing the lie article that we just talked about, but like below there are other articles that talk about liability in this context. And one of the articles I found kind of talks about a different proposal that is about like imposing mandatory insurance and compensation funds instead of imposing personal to AI. So like in this way, now you found like a possible counterplan idea that's going to lead you to, you know, a potential negative strategy that you could read against corporate personhood. So like, I think this kind of just based on one article, we were able to generate so many different ideas that that you could research. So I think that this approach of like kind of mapping the contours of argument, I think is a useful frame to have when you're researching and you don't necessarily know where to start. And eventually, once you keep iterating this process, you'll get close to the point where you can identify all the major apps and negatives, or at least most of them. So it feels like reading more articles doesn't necessarily lead to any additional information, in which case I think you kind of achieve your goal. And that will also become easier as the season goes on, because at that point you'll know what people are reading as an affirmative. So you're not kind of, you know, randomly searching for possible app ideas, like, you know, like this team reads this affirmative, so like I'm going to look at that article and then see like where that leads to, and hopefully you will find something. So I'm hoping that process was, you know, good illustration of it's a very small example, but it's a good illustration of identifying what to research. So now I kind of want to talk about once you know what to research, how you should actually research them. So I'm going to be talking about like different search strategies that you should use to research different components and different parts of an argument. And I kind of put it in the parentheses that it's all about the search terms, because they really matter in the type of articles, in generating the type of articles that you find. And I kind of broke it down this into like uniqueness, internal link, and impact. And I realized that is like, that kind of sounds like a disadvantage, but like really, you know, that structure of an argument is used for like both advantages and disadvantages. So I kind of structured it this way because I think it applies to like both when you're cutting an affirmative and when you're cutting a case negative. So in terms of uniqueness, I think that it's actually easier part of the debate, easier part of the argument to research, because they're often not really directly related to the plan. So like if you were to read a dissent about like spending, or dissent about like the economy, then like you will probably say plan is bad for the economy, but like the uniqueness claim that you'll make, which is that economy is like fine now, probably has nothing to do with the personhood question. So I kind of think that it's probably easier to research them, but at the same time, I think you know, one thing when you're first starting to research is that oftentimes the type of verbiage that we come up with in debate is not the one that is used by the people writing in the field. So for the economy DA, for example, a lot of times we say like, you know, economy is high, but then like, that's not how people really describe the economy. Like it's not a thing that is high or low, like it's more nuanced than just like one abstract economy that is like doing well or worse. So like, that's not exactly how people, like an economist would describe like the status of the economy. So I think what's important is to really mimic what are the words that people use to describe the economy. So I kind of put this card as an example that I cut last year, that I wanted to say that, you know, there is economy is doing fine, but it kind of talks about different indicators like the markets. It talks about the GDP, it talks about inflation, wages, unemployment. So there are different indicators of the economy. So instead of putting economy high, like you want to be researching economy in relations to these things and put those in the search terms so that you will, those are the articles that you will get, instead of like kind of, you know, abstract economy high articles. So I think that that's very important when you're researching uniqueness. And also I think applying the same thinking about creating contours of arguments is also relevant here. We are not obviously talking about like the solvency about, solvency articles about personhood, and has nothing to do with that question. But like there are people within a given, week, there are people who talk about like, oh, economy perhaps isn't doing so hot because of like some external event that happened, or wages are decreasing, or like whatever. So it kind of it is useful to adopt that thinking, because then you can also kind of excavate what people are saying about the economy and what is like the consensus of opinions about the current status or like current uniqueness about a particular issue, which I think is relevant for impacting the strength of either a disadvantage or an advantage. Like if you realize that, there's a lot of people who are saying really negative things about the economy given this week, then perhaps that is not the DA that you should be going for if you feel like you're not going to have enough articles on that. So I think just being knowledgeable about that, and as you're researching, I think that's another important and really strategic thinking to adopt. And I also think that uniqueness are all a lot of times like good negative arguments for a lot of affirmatives, just because that a lot of app solvency articles most of the time have really good internal link claims. So like, personhood is going to solve innovation, but then they don't, oftentimes like people in the real world don't really care a lot about uniqueness in a debate sense. So like they care more about whether a policy is going to be positive or negative, and they don't really think about like uniqueness as in like, doesn't match up with the direction of the status quo. So like this article kind of I included here, that is in response to like a app proposal to give IP rights to AI. And then it's indicting those proposals by saying that innovation is already high. So like, why do we even need personhood for AI? And like gives all of those different indicators. But there are all of these like different statistics cited in this in the article that perhaps you could look at the footnotes, or look through other articles that are referencing these numbers, which I think kind of allows another jumping point for you to look into when cutting the case snake. But also the language used here is a little bit more nuanced than saying innovation is high. Like that's not how people describe it. Like here it says investment in AI is increasing rapidly. So that's like a little bit more elegant language. So making sure that you're adopting that language to your search term definitely is useful. In terms of the link, I think we can pretty much follow the same format as like the app and K-snake exploration that I talked about in the first part of this discussion, because these are about like people debating about different proposals to establish AI. So I think that then like what to research, but again, like try to use the phrases and verbiage that people in the fields use. But I think in the context of the link, it's important to focus on the verbs, because that's where like people really kind of establish the link claim. So like this example card says that liability may disincentivize manufacturers from testing the AI system. So the important word in this context is like disincentivize, right? So I think kind of using those language and researching them in the context of the person would help a lot. And based on this article, I also found that there is this article called Legal Personhood for Artificial Intelligences by Lawrence Solon, which I think is a pretty popular article that people have been referencing. So that also allowed me to like to read this article and see like what that one says and see what other people have cited that says. But hopefully you'll be able to kind of find different relevant words or relevant keywords that you'll be able to incorporate when you're finding link argument. And the impacts, I think it's a little bit weird to research, just because we usually don't really think about these, like we don't really think about extinction most of the time. So researching them is kind of interesting, but for these, I like to compile a list of terms that are commonly used for different impact types. So for example, if the impact that you want to read is about like a regional hotspot, or like some conflict scenario where certain countries are like fighting over like one region and that will escalate. So in the first example, this card talks about like the Middle East war escalating, how that's going to involve like all of the great powers. The second article talks about I think it's about Asian conflict in Asia and the Korean Peninsula. And just kind of reading through this article, it looks like there are common terms such as like conflict, tinderbox, confrontation, weapons, great powers, bubbling, nuclear war, miscalculation drawn in, war, catastrophe. So instead of simply typing like war, Middle East, like all of these other articles will, all of these other search terms will allow you to find impact cards that are like describing the situation, so that will hopefully yield more results than simply just typing Middle East war extinction. And in the context of the environment, these two cards that I've included as an example, the first card is about like cultivated meat, talks about different like environment things, and the second card is about global warming. In the context of the environment, I think people tend to write in more dramatic fashion, because these are the things that could like actually cause all of us to potentially die. So I think you'll find a lot of articles that use really exaggerated language, probably because they're kind of true. So they use terms such as annihilation, extinction, humanity, human survival, tipping points, catastrophic, irreversible, and uninhabitable. So you can use these search terms to and then combined with like whatever impact that you're trying to find, whether that's like biodiversity, global warming, or sea level rise, or whatever. I think that will yield some good results. And there are also kind of structural impacts, and by these I mean things like hegemony or democracy, where like it's not like there's like a particular thing that really causes the impact, but just generally like having this structure is good for the world. And this is like a very popular impact card for liberal international order. And then kind of reading through this article, kind of common terms used are like collapsing, war, common problems, and then actual list of impacts such as like climate change, cooperation, humankind. So I think searching for those terms, in addition to things like liberal international order or democracy or hegemony or international law, I think would definitely help in finding some impact articles. But I think the kind of key lesson for all of these is to like kind of walk away from the type of language that debaters use, but like think about how like a writer would actually describe some of these claims and some of these problems. And I think it helps a lot if you're able to find one card and then kind of use similar language to find other cards. So that's how I try to find, once I find something, that's how I try to like expand upon them. So just going through those cards would definitely help a lot in the other cards that you want to potentially include. And lastly, I included topicality as its own section, because I think that these are like very difficult to research, and because they're not really written typically in a way that we think about writing. They're like really technical. They're written in a very technical fashion. So I mean, you could definitely go to the dictionary and like look for the term and then just like cut that. But I think I really recommend using Lexis and Nexus, because I think the best topicality evidence that you're going to find are in court cases. So like judges who have to apply different terminologies or different words, and then define what that means and apply them in a particular legal context, which I think is really important in this topic, because we are talking about legal topics. So I think looking into the court cases really help a lot. But you also have to think about like, what are good examples of like good definition cards for topicality. And oftentimes like they kind of use the language like definition of X, I define X, this is defined, or the term X or the word X. So I wanted to cut some cards that define like the United States, and whether that is like a federal government. So like in this search term, I use all of these different ways that one could possibly define the word United States, and then also search for federal government to be inserted in the middle, because that is the ultimately interpretation that I want. And the example card I cut using the search term, there's a card from Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit that kind of says that, taking the common meaning, the term United States means our nation, which acts through the federal form of government. So it looks like judge in this case used that language to describe what the United States mean. The card below that also say, the term United States is consistently interpreted as a reference to the federal government. So it looks like the way that people define words is by saying like, the phrase United States or the term United States. So those are the kind of the search terms that you want to use when you're trying to find cards that are defining something. And I'm pretty sure there are other ways to research topicality cards, but I know that you can still get plenty of just from researching Lexis. So I'd say that should be kind of like the first place that you go to. And the third part, I wanted to talk about other resources and tips, and these are like less search strategy and just like more different databases and like organizational tips when doing research. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is Google, which all of us use almost daily, and it's a really basic and an accessible tool for doing research. But it doesn't have to be basic. There are Boolean search terms in Google that will allow you to get better search results. And then some of the common ones that I use are quotations for looking up the exact term. So if you're interested in finding a card that like literally uses the phrase political capital for your politics uniqueness evidence, and that is something that you want to put in quotation. There are also, sometimes using dollar signs for price is helpful, like especially for like economy related things or other like currency related things. Minus sign, you can use it to exclude a search term if you're kind of getting results where they're using personhood, but like perhaps in a different context, and you don't want that. So you can use minus sign and like the term that you want to get rid of, so that your results are a little bit more streamlined. You can use that asterisk for wildcard or unknown. So in this phrase, like largest asterisk in the world would search for like, it will substitute any kind of word in the asterisk as long as it kind of says like, largest building in the world or like largest country in the world, and that's what you're going to get. You could also apply different restrictions such as like site and domain format and the date restriction, which I think utilizing all of this is really helpful depending on the context. So like sometimes you just want to be looking for PDFs files, and so you can apply the restriction. Sometimes you're only interested in articles written from the last month or so because you're cutting a uniqueness card, then you want them to be recent as possible. So all of these restrictions will be helpful in kind of filtering out your search results. And I think that reading through the preview of searches is really helpful to increase efficiency. So oftentimes I kind of look at, what Google provides right below the website. So here, I think I wanted to research the term executive power. So it looks like the term executive power standing alone has no real meaning. So this article actually seems to be talking a lot about that term and probably has more stuff to do with. So it looks promising. So those are the ones that I'm going to open a new tab and like make sure to read later because they might be something that I could cut cards from. And I think that this might get a little bit tedious, and I know there's a different thoughts about this, but for me, like, when you search something, you're going to get a lot of search results. And it's not really good for you to just like stop after like the third search page. Like, you should really go through at least 20, in my opinion, to really capture everything. And oftentimes you're going to find something like not on the first page that you see, but also like down the road, and that you're going to miss if you don't sort through all of them. So I know this could get a little bit tiring and boring, but making sure that you go through all of the search pages, I think would help a lot. Even if you don't find something that you want to cut necessarily, I think, again, this is another way that you could kind of increase your knowledge about like a subject area that you're researching. So I think even if you don't find the article that you're going to cut cards from, but it's still going to lead to like other articles that might have some promising results. So for example, this Paulson card, you know, talks about the executive power and looks like it was cited by 700 different articles. And then, those are the things that you should kind of sort through, which is going to take a lot of time, but it's going to be very worthwhile because you're going to find a lot of good things just looking through the articles that are cited by other articles citing this literature. And then the second resource I wanted to talk about is Lexis and Nexus, which I think I already preluded and really, I really love this resource. It's fantastic for legal research. And for me, I also don't really like the way that law review articles are presented in PDF format, where it's like really narrow. And in LexisNexis, you get to see like the full page, and like you can just like keep scrolling down. So that's also really easier on your eye and for readability purposes. And I really like Lexis because their Boolean function is even more detailed and more functional than Google. So what they allow you to do is like the first thing is you can use like W/ and you can put like a number like a 15, which allows you to search words that appear within certain word count. So if you were to put AI W/15 personhood, it will only include searches that have AI and personhood within like 15 words of each other. So those articles will be more pertinent to your research because it's not going to be like someone mentioning AI in paragraph 1 and then randomly talking about personhood in like the last paragraph. So these articles will be more topical to whatever topic that you're researching. And in the search string, you can also include synonyms so that instead of researching AI personhood, you can put AI or artificial intelligence so that it will capture articles that have AI personhood within 15 words and artificial intelligence within 15 words, and artificial intelligence and personhood within 15 words, which is important because sometimes like things are not abbreviated, so that you might miss those articles like in Google, for example, if you were to use like only AI or only artificial intelligence. And then you can also use asterisk for searching the base string of a word. So like a person might say a word distinguish in like different tenses. So like they could say distinguish, distinguishes, distinguished. So then kind of putting distinguish and then putting the asterisk would search for like present, past tense and other tenses potentially, so that you're able to capture those, which I think Google, if I'm not sure if you ever tried this, you're only going to get results that you put exactly corresponding to the words that you put exactly within the quotation. So like I've realized sometimes like simply changing the tense, I get like different search results, even though like the idea of like a search is the same. So I think that this is really helpful because you're able to like do that all at once instead of you keeping to update search results on Google. So kind of example search string, which I showed in previous section on topicality, like I'm able to search all of the different ways that people could define United States or talk about how they define the United States. So this is really helpful in like gathering all of those articles at once and just going through them and then, just keeping the ones that you like. So I think in this way, in the context of doing legal research and law reviews, I think it's an absolutely fantastic resource. And I don't think there's any other database that could really beat this. Other databases and sites that I use a lot, I use Factiva, which not all universities might have access to them, but they have a lot of newspaper subscriptions, like New York Times or Washington Post. So or Wall Street Journal is actually one common one that I use a lot. That I use Factiva a lot for accessing them. So they're definitely helpful in bypassing some of the paywalls, and sites like LibGen or Sci-Hub also allow you to get copy of ebooks or scholarly articles that you might not be able to get through school. So I think these databases are also really helpful. And in terms of organization, I definitely am not the most organized card cutter in the world. I feel like I have tabs open everywhere, and it's like oftentimes I like lose important article that I like kept because I like kept opening tabs, and then I forgot, oh, like where was the article that I wanted to cut 2 hours ago? Like they're gone. But I think that using tab managers on Google, that allows you to like group different tabs, and you can also like hide and unhide them, so that it gives you a little bit more room to sort through like your tabs. I think that helps a lot. And the other thing that that you should really implement in your practice is like actually saving articles and cards in your document, because even if you have access to the URL or the web page that you're cutting articles from, oftentimes like when you go back later, you don't really think about like, why did I save this research? Like what context was I thinking when I had this like web page saved? So like it's really helpful if you actually at least copy paste the part of the card, part of the article that you thought you were going to cut as a card there, so that at least like it's not gonna force you to have to reread the entire article again, like like kind of reading from the pasted text that, oh, like I meant to cut this as like a solvency advocate, like I meant to cut this as like a link, so that it will like help you be more efficient. And I think generally being organized means that you're more efficient later down the road. So even though you might have to spend some time in the beginning, know that it's going to pay off later, because it's going to be easier to like find things and continue from where you left off. The last section, I wanted to leave a little bit time on policy versus decay. Like I realized that I spent a lot of time about researching policy stuff, and that is, kind of not to say that critique literature are unimportant. It's just more like a personal failing, because I'm just more familiar with policy literature than the critique literature. But I think that it is important to acknowledge the differences between the two, or differences in terms of researching the two. I think in policy literature, the disagreement oftentimes tends to be more explicit. So like usually people completely say like, we should not establish personhood. This is a completely bad idea because of XYZ. So like there's an active debate over like whether we should take a course of action. But I think in the critique literature, it's a little bit more nuanced than simply like, this is good or bad. Like I think many might agree with certain components of the affirmative, but they kind of clash with minor distinctions. And so in that context, kind of thinking through researching critical arguments, how do you generate offense as a negative, is that I think despite the above, I think I like to apply similar thinking as researching policy arguments, in terms of like mapping different arguments. And then if you were to approach a policy app, like how you're going to like attack. So if you like to go for framework, finding a card that talks about the app in the context of legal and political engagement with the state would be like a good card. And you can kind of think of it as like a counter plan, that solves the affirmative. You can also find articles that disagree with the app's theory of power. So is it too pessimistic? How do they explain anti-Blackness? How does neoliberalism work? And this might be, it's kind of like cutting advantage answers to uniqueness. Like you're kind of, attacking the thesis, advantage of the affirmative. And you can also find articles that disagree with the app's methods. And there are, for example, there are many different ways to destroy capitalism, and some may be more effective than the other. So this is kind of thinking about like researching solvency, defense, or solvency takeout as to like a plan, basically. So kind of like you can apply, similar thinking, in terms of researching and guiding your research about when you're critical arguments. So just like a couple examples that I kind of gathered from my previous years. So I think in researching case neg versus critical affirmatives, I think that it's really important, especially important for you to read the affirmative evidence. So like things are not really clear cut in a lot of cases, even with the affirmative evidence, and there are many like conflicting things that you could potentially cut cards from. So on the healthcare topic a couple of years ago, there was a team that says that we should not expand expand insurance coverage, or that shouldn't be the focal point of like national health insurance. And then the article that they cited, I realized that, at the end kind of talks about that despite everything that that person said above, it doesn't necessarily undermine the case for a national health program. So I thought this would be like a very good, framework, topical version of the AF card that says that we actually, solve your affirmative, because they kind of implicitly endorse the idea that we should establish health insurance and provide coverage for vulnerable groups of people. And another example is this one, which is from the legalization topic. There was one team that talked about the notion of respectability politics and how Black women are coded within the legal sphere. And that this article was talking about that in the context of prostitution policy. And then I realized that that person at the end kind of concluded with, an actual legal proposal to address this, respectability politics issue and then coding of Black women within legal discourse. So that was like, oh, that's a good, topical version of the affirmative. This is a good counter plan. So I think just by reading affirmative evidence alone, I think you're going to be able to find a lot of good things that you could perhaps use to your advantage. And when you're cutting cards that attack a particular theory, I think most oftentimes a lot of critical affirmatives, like their theory of power, comes from like a prominent book. So Wilderson's theory of anti-Blackness, which is now very prominently debated. It's a kind of like go-to anti-Blackness literature that when I first started debate, it was like really recent, but then now there are a lot of people citing Wilderson's work, and then a lot of people writing about them. So it's always like that foundational text that's going to that people are going to drive their theory from. So I think that personally, it's useful for you to look at like book reviews, and I think that those are the places where people are going to like critique the whatever argument that someone had in the book. So I think this article is kind of responding to this person, Beller, who wrote about like AI. And I think there was a team from USC that read a lot of arguments from this person, but it was kind of inciting that Beller's, book with perspective of like from neoliberalism and how like their theory isn't sufficient to really capture what's going on. So I think that going to those book reviews and I think would definitely help a lot. This is another example that was reviewing the affect theory that kind of criticizes that theory. So I think that just kind of looking through those book reviews will definitely be helpful, because oftentimes it's not like someone in the Brookings Institute are not writing about capitalism. So you're going to have to find more literary people or like philosophy people who are writing about foundational texts. So I think that those are definitely helpful. And finally, just I talked about researching solvency, attacking the solvency of the app or like their methods. So, and I think that kind of referencing their author and foundational text is also really helpful. So this card that I cut, it was responding to Irigaray and the thesis of mimesis, and whether that's like a good method to adopt to break down patriarchy or gender violence. And this person is kind of like criticizing that logic, but it is referencing the particular author or particular text. So I think using that to guide your research would definitely help a lot. And oftentimes people kind of say like, despite this person's logic, or like they say this, or however, that theory is flawed. So I think that those are the search terms that you could potentially incorporate. Like sometimes this might sound really stupid, but I like put down author and then literally word however in quotation, and put it in Google and see what I get, because those are the articles that kind of say they're going to at least disagree with whatever author or whatever foundational text in some shape or form. So those are the articles that I see, and I sometimes I find good. And I think actually in this case that was how I was able to find this card. So I think just keep, and I think that method will be very fruitful in terms of finding and researching critical cards debating about the critical critical arguments. And so that is all I had. I wanted to leave some time at the end for question and answers, but I'm realizing that perhaps that might not work in this format. So we could stop now, but if you have any questions, feel free to send an email or hit me up on Facebook chat, and we can definitely talk about research more, because I like talking about research.
If people are in the live stream and you have a question, I'll give you like 10 seconds maybe. And if you type one, I can read it for Young. So wait for like a second. We've got some people in the live stream. All right. Well, in that case, take Young up on their offer to contact later, because they're a great resource. Thank you so much, Young, for joining us to talk through your expertise on research. I hope those who watched learned something. I definitely did. So that's it. Thank you, Young.
Sounds good. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting, Jackie.
Of course. All right. Bye, y'all.
Bye.